I was relatively new to Halifax. I come from Toronto in 2008. I had gone to Halifax from Toronto. So I was trying to still make kind of inroads with communities, Black communities and Indigenous communities. So this provided that opportunity. So I said very hesitantly, yes, I'll do it. And I started the project in 2012 and knew that it needed to be community engaged and community based, and then started to drive down to different communities starting in 2013. So that's when the journey began around this. I didn't really know what I was doing. I always say to people that I was kind of throwing things against the wall just to see what stuck. But I think that was a good approach, because what Enrich has become now is very multi-method, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, intersectional, multi-digital. I mean, I'm willing to try everything and anything that makes sense for the project to address environmental racism. So I'm just going to start with my journey. Next slide. So I always like to begin with this quote because it describes the health effects of environmental racism. And I think this is something that a lot of, well, at least the people in government didn't really want to accept. When I met with them several times, they seemed to downplay the health effects. And maybe they were worried about lawsuits, things like that. But when I drove down to the African Nova Scotian community of Lincolnville to do a workshop, this is what was said. This is somebody who's talking about the increasing rates of cancer, specifically rare cancers and other illnesses in the African Nova Scotian community of Lincolnville, which has had a dump in that community since 1974, and then a second dump placed on top of the first generation landfill in 2006. So they had two dumps, first generation landfill, or dump, shall I say, and the second generation dump placed over it. So this person was talking about how, cancer has increased. People tend not to believe the community, and they're like, why wouldn't they believe us? If cancer is a reality in other communities, why wouldn't it be in ours? Next slide. This is James Desmond, so probably the very, very first activist I ever met around environmental racism. Unfortunately passed away in April of last year. So when we went, as I said, we were driving up to different communities in 2013 to meet them, because I knew that it needed to be a community engaged project. So wanted to meet people and get a sense from them about what I should be doing with my project. Instead of being, typically as a professor, you start with what you want to do, you start with your objectives, and then you go in. I thought, well, that's probably not the way to do it, so let me hear what they want from me. So when I visited Lincolnville, and this is James Desmond, we spoke certainly because there were workshops being held, but we were also filming. So there's, before the Netflix documentary, there's a really great film that was produced by Pink Dog Productions in Nova Scotia, which is on my website, and this is in the film. It's called In Whose Backyard? And we filmed James asking him how he would define environmental racism, and this is how he defines it. And I like to show this because I think the way that he defines it is very simple, but complex at the same time. He's captured everything that environmental racism is, and it actually reflects in many ways, regardless of how short the definition is. It reflects the more academic definition of environmental racism, which I'll share with you later. But here he's talking about that environmental racism is a practice. It's a practice of disproportionality. It's a practice of placing dumps and industry and various environmental hazards in communities of color, in Indigenous communities, and in white communities as well. Not white communities as often, but I know of one white community in Nova Scotia called Harrietsfield, which is a low-income rural community that has been fighting for clean water since the 1980s. So it's not typical. It's typically people of color and Indigenous communities, but there are also low-income white communities. If you remember Flint, Michigan, and the water crisis there that we heard about back in 2014, it was a mixed community, African Americans and low-income white people. So it is possible. This is an issue of race and class and geography and socioeconomic status and education. So I love his very succinct definition of environmental racism. Next slide. But there's a much more academic definition by Dr. Robert Bullard, who is considered to be the father of environmental justice, and he's teaching currently at a university in Texas. You know him?
Well, we all knew his name, that's for sure.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, he wrote a book in the early 1990s called Dumping in Dixie. And if you, you see the definition there, you'll see it reflects very much what James Desmond just said, it's just longer. So with Dr. Bullard, he's saying it's about the disproportionate location and greater exposure of indigenous and racialized communities to contamination and pollution. The fact that when we see a spatial patterning of industry primarily in those communities doesn't mean that other communities are not impacted, but it's mostly these communities. And secondly, it's about the lack of political power. So when James Desmond in that photo said, kind of these communities do not have clout, it's about not having political, economic, and social clout, which often means that you're not heard by government. It certainly doesn't mean that you're not resisting, engaged in activism, engaged in advocacy, because certainly the communities that we know, indigenous communities, other communities, have been fighting. They've been involved in civil disobedience. They're trying to make their voices heard, but they're often not heard because they lack social, political, and economic clout or power. Third, it's about the implementation of policies that sanction these harmful, or the harmful placement of these industries in certain communities. So when we see, once again, the spatial patterning of industry in certain communities, it's because of policy. Everything comes out of policy. So we have to think of environmental policy, environmental assessments, and why decisions are made to place these toxic sites in communities of color and indigenous communities, right? It's the decision makers, the policy makers, who are typically not members of impacted communities who are making these decisions. So when we talk about discrimination in general, whether we're talking about discrimination in healthcare, in education, labor, employment, all of which are of concern in Canada, the root of it is policy, and the root of it is policy makers and the decisions that they're making, oftentimes making decisions to protect their community or what they think is their community. And then it becomes an us versus them. And that was highlighted at a talk I gave at Dalhousie for students, where I was talking about Lincolnville. I was talking about the first and second generation landfill. And a white young student, female student, stood up and she said, "So Dr. Waldron, you're talking about Lincolnville, but where do you suggest then that they place it? In our community?" And I was a bit stunned, didn't know what to say. But there is that to me tells you in many ways what this is about. It's about we need to protect our community. And communities that are seen as not valuable, not having any worth, Black communities, indigenous communities, are the ones who bear the brunt of this. If we are to be real, it's about who is seen as having worth and value, and Black communities, indigenous communities are not. Environmental racism is also about the disproportionate negative impacts of environmental policies that result in the differential rates of cleanup. So that's when you have to ask, why does it take so long for certain communities to get redress? So I think of Pictou Landing First Nation, Boat Harbor, the toxic site in Pictou Landing First Nation, that has had effluent being dumped in their community into Boat Harbor since 1967. And in 2020, that's when they finally got redress, despite the fact that they've been active on the issue specifically since the 1980s. Why does it take so long? Other communities that I'll talk about later, why does it take so long for these communities to get redress? Once again, you can go back to social, economic, political clout and power. The final aspect of environmental racism is the history of excluding the very communities that are impacted. So those are the communities that do not have a seat at the table. People often talk about, I want to have a seat at the table. I want to be involved in policy making. and decision-making, because this is about my community, and I want to have an opportunity to share my thoughts, my opinions, my suggestions or recommendations about how this can be resolved. But the communities that are impacted are never asked to be at the table. So environmental racism is about the intergenerational ongoing exclusion of impacted communities in environmental decision-making and policy-making. And when we exclude the communities that are impacted and we don't hear from them, hear about their opinions and suggestions about how they would like this problem to be addressed, then I think environmental racism just continues to manifest over time. So that's the central aspects of the definition of environmental racism from Dr. Bullard. Next slide. So I want to share some case studies with you of impacted communities impacted by environmental pollution, starting with communities in Nova Scotia, since that's where I began my work. But this is just a snapshot. There are many more. So let's start first with Sipekne'katik First Nation. Sipekne'katik First Nation. Starting in 2014, Alta Gas planned to implement a brine discharge pipeline in the Sipekne'katik River. Of course, the community was very concerned about fish, concerned about the impacts of climate change, concerned about health and well-being. Alta Gas tried to convince everyone that there's no health risk, even though there were studies from the United States that indicated that there were. I remember I was holding a event at the Central Library in Halifax in 2015 and got a very long email from a representative at Alta Gas, not happy that I was holding the event, and basically saying to me that I shouldn't be talking about certain things at the library. And I contacted the librarian, and she says, we don't tell people what to say. It's your event, and you can share whatever information you want. But they seem to be very intimidated or anxious about the fact that I was holding that event. But that email from that woman was extremely long. Scared me. Scared me. I can get easily scared. You know, when I get negative emails, I'm like a weakling. I get terrified. I mean, I have colleagues who get really horrendous emails from people, particularly if you're doing anti-racism work. They get some horrible emails, and I have to say I've never gotten that for some reason. But whenever I get long emails like that, so that's Sipekne'katik First Nation. Next slide. I just spoke about Pictou First Nation. So that's a journalist. I forgot his name. A journalist gave me that photo while he was flying over the Boat Harbor. So since 1967, as I mentioned earlier, a mill had been, up until 2020, dumping effluent into Boat Harbor, and this used to be a pristine hunting and fishing ground for the indigenous community.
Where was that?
Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia, Pictou First Nation. And I should mention that the indigenous community is the Mi'kmaq community primarily in Nova Scotia. And in the 1980s, I would say the community got a bit more aggressive in terms of challenging this and trying to stop this, and there were broken promises by the government probably since around the 1980s. Over time, they kept making promises, and finally in 2020, or I should say at the end of 2019, the government announced that they would be closing the mill in 2020, at the end of January 2020, because they wanted the mill to find alternative ways to handle the water, and they never did. It wasn't robust enough. They looked at the approach and they thought it wasn't robust enough, and he said, we have been making broken promises to this community since the 80s. That needs to stop. The mill will close. And the mill did close at the end of January 31st, 2020. It created a lot of conflict in Nova Scotia at that time because people lost their jobs. And this announcement was made the week of Christmas. As somebody who's concerned about health and cancer, and this is a community that's had a lot of cancer, I was elated that it closed, but then there was the other side, people lost their jobs. And that created a conflict between even the chief of Pictou First Nation. I believe her daughter was somebody tried to drive her daughter off the road. They got a lot of emails and hate mail because they were certainly advocating for the closure of the mill. So that was a horrible time in Nova Scotia. And the chief and her daughter, they were terrified every day because of the backlash they were getting. I'm hearing stuff right now that a mill will open again. So I have to, which is horrible, but that's what I'm hearing, that something is going to open up again. So we'll see. Next slide. Many of you probably know about Amjinwang First Nation near Sarnia, Ontario. Often referred to, interestingly enough, as Chemical Valley. That says everything. This is, to me, probably the worst case scenario of environmental racism. You've got over 60 petrochemical facilities surrounding this community, and that to me just says somebody's trying to kill them. You surround a community with over 60 petrochemical facilities. And so this is a community that has extremely high rates of cancer and birth anomalies, gestational issues, reproductive issues, reproductive cancers. Next slide. I'm sure you've heard of Grassy Narrows First Nation near Kenora, Ontario. So in the 1960s, mercury was dumped into the Wabigoon English River. And I think there was cleanup, multi-million dollars devoted to cleanup in 2015. However, in 2022, there was a CBC article that came out where community members were discussing the health impacts of mercury dumping. And many of them talked about less serious impacts, but the serious ones were cognitive delays, neurological issues, certainly rashes perhaps are less serious. So that just kind of goes to show that while you may engage in cleanup, the government, the health impacts remain. So it's great to have cleanup, but there are health impacts that continue to impact the community. Next slide.
It was a pulp and paper mill that was dumping them cap into the
Yes, I think it's called Reed Paper Mill. Reed Paper Mill. Next slide. And you probably heard of Wet'suwet'en First Nation. I think I heard about it maybe about the first time 7 years ago. And over the past several years, there have been mass demonstrations and sit-ins across Canada trying to halt this project. It's a multi-billion-dollar project. And they've been, people across Canada have been supporting the chiefs around this particular issue. So this is happening in northern British Columbia. Next slide. When people think of environmental racism, they also don't think of Black communities. And perhaps there are not a lot of Black communities in Ontario or other parts of Canada dealing with this, but during my time in Nova Scotia, my 13 years there, I noticed that a lot of Black communities, for whatever reason, are dealing with environmental racism. I talked earlier about environmental racism being about race, class, socioeconomic status, and geography. And I wonder whether or not it has to do with the Black communities in Nova Scotia with geography. There are over 40 historic African Nova Scotian communities. This is the first and oldest Black community in Canada. They are not an immigrant community. They are over 400 years old. They are descendants of Black loyalists from the United States from the War of 1812. So they migrated to Nova Scotia, many of them from the United States, but also descendants of Jamaican Maroons and people from Sierra Leone. But they're isolated communities. And when I talked about geography earlier, it's much easier to place a dump or a hazardous industry in a community that's forgotten, that everybody's forgotten about, the public has forgotten about, government has forgotten about. These typically are isolated, rural or semi-rural communities. Basically, every single African Nova Scotian community, all 45 of them, are rural and semi-rural. There's one called the North End of Halifax that was going through gentrification. When I came to Halifax in 2008, they were dealing with gentrification and being pushed out, but 99% of the Black communities in Nova Scotia are isolated and in rural, out-of-the-way places. And poor development. Some of them don't have hospitals in the area. This is one of them that no longer exists. It's called Africville. And Africville is one of the historic Black communities that I would say suffered from both environmental racism and gentrification at the same time. Gentrification, because they were being pushed out by the city of Halifax that was engaged in a renewal campaign in the 1960s, in the late 1960s, and they needed the community out. The church, the church in Africville was even burnt down. There are photos that you can see with dump trucks taking young children out. Africville residents went to many places. They went to Uniacke Square in the north end of Halifax. They went to Montreal. But the main point is they couldn't stay because the city was making way for industrial development. So that's the gentrification, urban renewal aspect to it. Why is it environmental racism? It's environmental racism because in the wake of industrial development was left a number of social and environmental hazards. So the environmental hazards included a slaughterhouse, a fertilizer plant, a tar factory, a stone and coal crushing plant, a cotton factory, a prison, 3 systems of railway tracks, and an open dump. And in terms of health and mental health, the community would say being pushed out has had a long-lasting impact on us. I'm currently, well, I'm not writing it, I finished my next book on racial trauma in black communities in the UK, the US, and Canada. And this was trauma. Even though it happened a long time ago, I remember about 2 years ago, an Africville descendant, very popular activist, Irvin Carvery, said to me, Ingrid, when are you going to do a study on the mental health impacts of what happened in Africville? You know, because people are still suffering from that loss. They're still suffering from the loss of their homes and the loss of their land. So this is what we often refer to as racial trauma. So there have been real mental health impacts. And I'll talk about it later, but they often rise up, descendants of Africville, asking the government for reparations, asking 3 levels of government for reparations. Next slide. Lincolnville, so you just saw Irvin Carvery earlier. This is his community. This is the first and second generation landfill. My research assistant took this photo when we went there in 2013. As I said before, ever since 1974, when the first generation landfill was placed there have been increasing rates of cancer. There's a liner, but the liner is degraded. So I have to get my thing straight. So a dump does not have a liner, and a landfill has a liner. That's the difference. So of course a dump is more dangerous if it doesn't have a liner. Although there's a liner here, it's a degraded liner, and apparently it costs millions of dollars to get a new one. So I think the municipality never got a new liner. So I'm assuming that the one from 1974 is still there. So even if it doesn't, even if it has a liner, this is a dangerous site. And community members talk about rare cancers in their dogs, respiratory illness, etc., etc. Next slide, please. Shelburne. I don't know if you saw the Netflix documentary, but you would have met Louise DeLille in my documentary. She would be the main activist in Shelburne. South Shelburne is primarily African Nova Scotian. North Shelburne is primarily white. There are 2 problematic issues in South Shelburne. In addition to being close to a dump so this is a dump, that has been there since 1942. There are also issues with the black community not being on town water. So let's just talk about the dump. So the dump, the community would say everything and anything went in there. Stuff from the military base, syringes from the hospital, dead animals, everything and anything. And when I met with Louise DeLille, the activist from Shelburne, at the end of 2015, I was trying to hire somebody to do focus groups for me, and she got the job. And when she sat down, she said, environmental racism, is this what's been happening to my community? I said, yeah, kind of, but environmental racism is also about a pattern. It's not just about one community, but it's a pattern over time. And she felt kind of relieved that while it's a weird term, environmental racism, there was something to hold on to. Now things made sense now. And she said to me, Ingrid, basically everybody in my community has cancer. 95% of the people in my community, and I didn't believe her because I thought that doesn't make any sense. And then I remember reading an article, I think in the New York Times, of an African American community near Louisiana. That community was called, what was it called?
Cancer Alley.
That's it. I remember Cancer Alley, and I've read that article about that community, so many people had cancer, and they were surrounded, just like Andre First Nation, surrounded by petrochemical facilities. And I said to myself, okay, I guess maybe Louise is telling me the truth. I just thought it was just so weird that everyone in a community can have cancer. But she's right, she actually did a survey. She's just a resident. She went house to house and actually just asked people who's died of cancer, how many people, etc. And she sent us that survey a while ago. They did get redress, and I'll talk about that later. Next slide. Greater Toronto area, racialized and simultaneously immigrant communities are most impacted by air pollution. And there was a particular case in Scarborough. So just in general, Etobicoke and Scarborough are communities that are impacted by pollution. But there was the notorious case of the McClure radioactive site in Scarborough that led a group of immigrant racialized residents to rally against this. They were given radioactive land without warning.
Oh, I remember that.
You do?
Rosalie Bertel was involved in all of that.
And there's also a book on this by somebody by the name of Heightenton. And they engaged in a decade-long battle with the Ontario government around this, and they won, surprisingly. Next slide. So we need to talk about the health effects of environmental racism, although sometimes government bodies don't want to undermine and obscure this issue, but it's a health issue without a doubt. There's enough Canadian literature over the past 25 years talking about the link between illness and environmental injustices. And what we refer to that as environmental health inequities. So if you are more burdened by toxins, you will be more burdened by health issues or illness. And you have people like Atari and Baxter and Lugana and Masuda, Jeffrey Masuda at I think the University of Victoria. They've done work on the health effects of environmental racism for over a decade. So there's no doubt that there's a link. The extent to which there's a link is something that needs to be determined case by case. So we do need to look at the health and also the mental health impacts of environmental racism. That's often left out. There are, when I speak to communities, particularly Shelburne, they talk about the stress, they talk about the psychosocial stressors, they talk about drug abuse among African Nova Scotian men in Shelburne, because they're dealing with a lot of issues, but they're also dealing with the dump. They talk about the stigma of living near the dump. They talk about when they were young and they went to school and how the smell from the dump went on their clothes, but the teachers thought they hadn't bathed. So there's a stigma, as they've said to me, of being black in Nova Scotia, tied with a stigma of living near a dump, to the point where you're seen as the dump, as Louise said to me. You are the dump. You're black, you're African Nova Scotian, you live near a dump, you're trash. And they kind of carry that weight with them. So I think we need more studies on the psychological impacts of living near to toxic industries. So some of the common health issues related to environmental degradation: cancer, of course, respiratory diseases, congenital anomalies, cardiovascular disease, skin disease, and allergies, etc., etc. I was also surprised to learn a few years ago that autism. I remember I met with an Indigenous elder in Membertou in Nova Scotia, and he talked about autism, and secretly I thought, oh God, no, that couldn't be. Autism, I thought neurological, and I thought, no, that's a bit way out when he said that. And then two years later, there was a prestigious American journal that came out talking about environmental exposure and autism. So there's so many things that we don't realize are illnesses that are connected to environmental exposure. Next slide. So we talk about environmental racism typically as a race issue, socioeconomic status, education, geography, where you live. It's also a gendered issue. Somebody mentioned a professor at York who wrote the book, Our Chemical Selves, Our Toxic Selves.
Oh, yes.
I love that book because in reading that book, I understood the gendered pathways through which pollution, contaminants travel through the body, and it's very, very gendered. So really, it broadened my understanding of how gender is also central. So looking specifically at Indigenous women, when we think about the gendered realities of environmental exposure, Indigenous women, and I talked earlier about reproductive cancers, reproductive anomalies, the birth ratio, I have it in my book so I forgot the numbers, but the birth ratio is out of whack in Amjinwang First Nation. It's not the norm, it's not the Canadian norm, it's either more males to females or the other way around.
The other way around, like, did we have enough boys for baseball teams, for boys' baseball teams?
So it's more women,
Yeah.
right.
Well, the same
Yes.
males, what's happening
Right.
with the boys.
So that's a very good example of the gendered impacts of environmental racism. But, you know, when you think of men who are typically working in construction, disproportionately to women, they're being exposed in different ways. Or when you think of people in job ghettos, like racialized immigrant women who clean our hotel rooms, and their exposure to the stuff that they're using to clean our hotel rooms. Understanding this as an intersectional issue is really, really important. An intersectional issue that takes into account gender, identity, sexual orientation, class, socioeconomic status, race, culture. That broadens, it helped me to broaden my understanding of environmental racism. Okay, next slide. I'm going to talk about what I've been trying to do over the past few years, my journey, as I like to call it. My journey, you know, at some points where I just kind of wanted to give up, because it just seems, anybody who's in the environment field knows, or climate change particularly, knows that it's a tough road, and that you make progress, and then you don't, and then there are steps back, you get frustrated, you get burned out, and then you try again. So that's how it's felt for me. As I said, I started this project in 2012, and I knew it had to be community engaged, but I didn't know it had to be everything it became. I think what I did was I just opened myself up to everything, as I said, and anything. And while that seemed a bit haphazard in the beginning, and it felt for me, oh Ingrid, you don't know what you're doing. I felt like I was trying to work through a puzzle, but I thought, I kept thinking about what I'm missing. I'm not an environmental scientist, I'm not. At some point I just forgot about all that. I said, Ingrid, you're a sociologist, you can bring something to this. It's gonna be different. You're not gonna know about pollutants and contaminants, you probably never will, but you do know about colonialism. You do all the stuff that sociologists, I think, are good at. Capitalism, colonialism, racism. That stuff we're good at. So I said, how do I bring all of that? I'm just gonna do this differently. It's probably not, I don't know who's gonna like it, but I can't do the other stuff, because I don't have that background. But it ended up becoming multi-method, as I said earlier, multi-approach, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, multimedia, without me planning that, but just about me being open to people who would say, Dr. Waldron, can I see you in your office, please? I was open. I said, as I say to people, I said yes to everyone who said to me or called me up and said, can I meet you in your office? I love that stuff you're doing there, but I want to talk to you about maybe another path. And I always say I'm so thankful that I was open, because I had a hydrogeologist, is that what they're called? Hydrogeologist come to me who had attended my event. Good event, Ingrid, good event, but have you ever thought of giving the communities a win? And I said, what do you mean by win? He said, well, something they can hold on to. You know, the legislation you're trying to pass, good, great. The research you're doing, great. Events, the event last night was wonderful. But how about giving the communities a win? I got a bit frustrated, because I'm thinking to myself, I'm doing this, what more does he want? But I had the good idea to keep my mouth shut. Because I said that to myself, I said, keep your mouth shut, Ingrid, and listen to this man. Thankfully, I listened to him, because what we did together is something I'm really proud of, and I'll talk about that later, and it's tangible. So with this project, I think the way it developed is because I was open to different people, to working with different disciplines. I'm not in a silo. I'm not interested in being in a silo and being a sociologist, only talking to sociologists, or only talking to health people. I noticed through my work that everybody had a place. The engineer, professor and student, the health student, the political science, they all came to me, particularly at Dalhousie. I got students wanting to help and volunteer from so many different disciplines. At that time, I didn't understand it, and now I do, because I see environmental racism as very multidisciplinary, and the solution to it is multidisciplinary. We need all these people from different disciplines to think through this, right? So, next slide. The first thing I needed to do was raise awareness, because I got quizzical looks from journalists and the public and different people saying, environmental racism, are you serious? And somebody made a comment in the Chronicle Herald, the newspaper, the main newspaper in Halifax. That's when they printed nasty comments. They don't anymore. And I think this comment actually was hilarious. I have no problems with it. I think it was great, funny. The person said, is Dr. Waldron serious? Environmental racism? What is she going to come up with next? Environmental sexism? And I laughed because that's funny. But in those early days, people weren't getting it, just like I didn't get it, so I don't blame them. When the activists came to me and said, I want you to take on a topic of environmental, I thought, what a stupid name, what does that mean? I'm not going to hang my hat on that. So I got it, I wasn't offended. And a lot of people didn't understand it. Journalists were curious, and they were like, environmental racism, can you explain that to me? And over time, I think I would say that Nova Scotia has probably more of an understanding of this issue than anyone, because I did so much awareness raising projects and activities. Next slide. So I spent a lot of time just hosting events. Here's an event at the Central Library. I always show this photo because this is my favorite event, even though I've had many events since. It just felt inspirational. As usual, if you're putting on an event, you have a panel of people from different perspectives. A politician is standing there. You have community people sitting, and you have Lynn Jones, a noted activist in Halifax, everybody giving their perspectives. We had a Mi'kmaq Indigenous drum group. We had an African drum group. It was educational. It felt inspirational. We had people standing. It was like 300 people in the room. It felt inspirational. And after that, that's when the hydrogeologist called me, because he was in the audience. And that's where I get students who say, I love your event. I didn't know this was happening in Nova Scotia. I'm from Nova Scotia. How can I help? Which is magic to a professor who maybe right now doesn't have a grant, right? So when people say, how can I help? It's like, yeah, come. So I put on a lot of events like that, trying to make each one different. If you hold a lot of events, you have to find a way to make it unique. Next slide.
Please.
Multimedia has been important to me, because I realize, certainly as a professor, we know that the students sitting in our classroom learn differently. And learn differently and want to gain knowledge differently, in different ways. So do our audiences. As professors, our audiences are the people that we want to read our journal articles, or who we want to attend your event. Like, you have an audience. It's almost like I'm being a marketer or an advertiser. You have an audience. How do they want that information shared? What's the resource or product that you need to create in order to share it, for example, to the policymaker? Is it a policy brief? So it's almost like, I think it's marketing, and to me, that's the fun part of it. So I realize that people want to learn differently. They want information about environmental racism differently. Do they want to read my book? Not necessarily. Do they want to read the journal articles that I've written? Not necessarily. Not everybody wants to. The scholar does, maybe, but the regular community folks, perhaps, but not necessarily. So next slide. This is kind of one multimedia educational policy tool that was created for my project by my research assistant using GIS analysis. I was kind of lamenting to him. I said, there's so much doubt about my project. People don't believe it. They don't think environmental racism is real. And he said, well, why don't you map it? I said, what do you mean? Before him, I had never heard of GIS analysis. He said, map it. I said, what's that? What do you mean? He said, put it on a map. Show the different areas in the Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotian communities, their communities, and then show where the dumps are.
Yeah.
Now, this is flat map, but if you go onto my website, there are 2 layers, one for African Nova Scotians, one for Indigenous. And that's what he did. And some of the doubters came back to me later. Oh, Professor Waldron, I can see it now. Or I heard from some Dow professors saying they're using it in their classroom. This is a great tool. It's an educational tool. It's a data collection tool. It's a policy tool. If I were to go to a policymaker, yes, I would share statistics and stories, but I'd also show this. This is proof. This is evidence. And I noticed that after this was published by Canadian Geographic and CBC, there was some legitimacy around environmental racism after that. And certain people came back to me and said, I can see it now. Right? So now I do a lot of mapping. Like I have my coalition, we're now doing a Canada-wide map that's going to map cases of environmental racism and climate change. This one is just environmental racism and it's just Nova Scotia. Next slide.
That's a very good visual way to look at it.
Yes.
In living color.
Yeah, and I think the colors actually attracted people too. It was so colorful and bright, right? Elliot Page. Well, this is a long story, but boy, I still can't believe this happened. So this is my book was published in April 2018, so I was doing the typical thing, book launches, etc. And I was at home one day, and I noticed that my Enrich Project website, Twitter page was very active. And typically it's my personal Twitter page that's active, because that's the page I'm on most often. And this person is talking about my book, promoting it, getting Ingrid Waldron's book, supporting the women on the front lines of environmental justice organizing, promoting my Enrich organization. I had seen Elliot on my Twitter, but didn't realize it was the actor because the photo was so obscure. Elliot was wearing like a chapeau down, and then the color was sepia, like a brown, and it didn't say Elliot Page, movie star. So it didn't hit, even though I had seen Juno twice in 2007, and I saw Inception with Leonardo DiCaprio. So I had an idea of who he was, but it just didn't hit. So I just thought, somebody's promoting my book, well, that's nice. Went away, 4 weeks later came back, and I'm like, okay, this is exploding, what's happening here? So I traced it back up to this Elliot Page person, and I said to myself, oh my God, is this the actor, and why would he be following me? Like, I've never had a movie star follow me. It didn't make any sense, and I didn't even know he was an activist of any kind. So I said, it is. So I DM'd him, and I said, I would like to thank you very much for promoting my book, blah, blah, blah. And he said to me, I just want to use my platform, my celebrity, to help. And then I realized that Lil McPherson, who owned a restaurant, two branches in Dartmouth and Halifax, has known Elliot for 15 years, and I was on an advisory committee with Lil. So I just started to talk about, Elliot Page, blah, blah. She said, Elliot Page? Oh, I've known him for 15 years, Ingrid. Do you want me to connect you? I said, yes. We connected at the end of 2018, the week of Christmas, on a phone call. I happened to have a 1-800 number, and the three of us just kind of talked about what we could do. We hadn't settled on anything. And then we decided we would do it again early January. So January of 2019, Lil, myself, Elliot, but this time with 3 women from Pictou Landing First Nation and Sabaganagadie First Nation were on the call. And we decided on a short 10-minute video that we would post on Twitter. That's all we were thinking of. We weren't thinking of a documentary. Just how do we create awareness, because that was my thing at that point. Because I'm thinking, I've got Elliot Page interested. Elliot Page had 2 million followers at that time. I probably had about 3,000. And I thought, wow, if I put out a petition and Elliot shares it, can you imagine what that would do? That's as far as I was thinking. And everybody was squealing. Everybody was so excited. 10-minute videos on Twitter. We were so excited. The other woman was squealing. Elliot came up April 13th. First filmed me in my condo. My God, Elliot Page in my living room. Filmed me with just a basic camera, nothing fancy. This was not supposed to be fancy because it was supposed to be 10-minute videos on Twitter. One little camera with the co-director, Ian, Daniel, and Elliot's personal assistant. And then for that week, over 6 days, they went to all the communities that you see in the film. And then they invited me to Elliot's mother's home, the mother's in Halifax, and they allowed me to watch the full documentary, and I saw people crying, I saw how emotional it is, and I thought, slapping this onto Twitter is not going to do this justice. This is a serious issue, it's environmental racism. We said We want awareness. And I thought, what better way to get awareness than a documentary full length? So I said that to Ian Daniel, the co-director. I said, why don't we just make this like a documentary? He said, you mean like 70 minutes? And I said, yeah, don't we want to create awareness? And I said, why don't we maybe send it to TIFF, Toronto? I kept going. I said, Toronto International Film Festival, the Berlin Film Festival, Robert Redford's film. I kept going because I thought these are international audiences and we want people to know about this. They agreed, actually. And we put it into TIFF. Next slide. It premiered on September 9th, 2019. Elliot paid for all of us to come down, and our hotel and some friends. My mother was there, my sister. And what was also great about that day, this perfect knowledge mobilizing that faculty members talk about, is that in addition to having a documentary on my very first book, premiere at TIFF, Elliot's publicist had set up like a whole bunch of meetings with media. Los Angeles Times, Rolling Stone magazine, Entertainment Tonight Canada, on and on, different American entertainment programs and magazines. And it created such awareness about the topic. It was kind of everywhere for that month, maybe. And interviews with me and Elliot for different news programs. It was just a high. I was on a high. This was one of the best times of my life, running to different media outlets, having the film premiere, and the gifts that have happened since then is just too many to remember since 2020. But the people have contacted me wanting to help, saying, I can't believe Shelburne doesn't have clean water. How can I help? Or after I left the premiere, I'm walking to my hotel and 3 black women from this organization called the Black Heritage Society saying, we just saw your film at TIFF. I can't believe Shelburne doesn't have clean water. We are the Black Heritage Society. We would like to donate some money. And then I moved a little further down the road, and a South Asian woman stopped me. I just saw your film. Can't believe Shelburne doesn't have clean water. I'd like to help. Then I returned to Halifax, and I'm typing, as we do as academics, at 1 in the morning. And I got an email come through from a man in Mississauga. I just saw your film. This is just, Canada doesn't have clean water. This is just really, I can't believe this. Can you put me in contact with Louise DeLille in Shelburne? It was just stunning. And even people from around the world, when it went to Netflix, next slide, when I went to Netflix March 29th of 2020, just after COVID hit, people from around the world contacted me saying, I thought, I thought Canada was a beacon of light.
What's the title?
I can't believe this is happening. How can I help? Right?
What's the title of your film?
There's Something in the Water.
Oh.
Yeah, it's from my book, There's Something in the Water, but my book also says Indigenous and Black Communities.
Who made the film and how was it distributed?
The film was co-produced by myself, Elliot Page, and Ian Daniel, the director, through Netflix. So it's just, but also at that time, Amazon Prime, Microsoft Xbox, and Apple TV. So with Netflix, we had a 3-year contract, so it's not there anymore.
That's amazing.
But with Apple TV still there, and Amazon Prime still there, and Microsoft Xbox, I think, still there. And in various universities, right, as well. So I made sure that when I moved to McMaster, they had it, Dalhousie has it, etc.
And you had print material to go with the film?
What do you mean?
People has a print material to go with the film.
No.
Those booklets or pamphlets or...
No, that would have been a nice idea. No. Just a book.
I'll introduce you to her films and all the literature.
Yeah, you mentioned one of her.
All the films that I produced, we always had a book. We made a book.
Educational.
But I don't know if Netflix does that, to be honest with you.
No, that would be
No, they don't do that.
through your website.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
can do it through your website.
Yeah. So that's Netflix, and I would say that I continue to get gifts from that time. People still kind of watch the movie, and they reach out to me, and they also sometimes want help. Like some of them wanted me to connect them to Elliot. There was a lot of trickery happening at that time. One person said, "Can I get Elliot's phone number?" of course, I was making sure that I wasn't going to, Elliot trusted me. But I got a lot of emails where people were trying to, which is fine, use me to get to Elliot. And they did it in very clever, creative ways. So it was a funny time, and I was just laughing. Next slide. So I continue to engage with media, and not everybody likes to do it, but I also think that not everybody understands what environmental racism is. So I continue to do interviews, podcasts, television, radio to create awareness. Next slide. And of course, as a faculty member, next slide, I have to do research. The research I'm doing right now, I love it because it's multidisciplinary. I've got a planner on board, an architect, a statistician, I'm a sociologist, a cancer biologist, a microbiologist. We are looking at Shelburne, that I've talked about a lot. Why are there such high rates of cancer in Shelburne? Why are there such high rates of multiple myeloma, the blood cancer, in Shelburne? The community believes it's the dump. You can't tell them anything else. But as researchers, we have to be responsible, and we want to explore, okay, yeah, it probably is a dump, but could it also be, so there are 4 things we're looking at. Could it also be lifestyle factors, such as diet, exercise, smoking? Can it be the social determinants of health, which would be my domain in the research? The social determinants of health, racism, sexism, classism, poverty, income. Could it be the material in the dump? So the planner and the architect, they already looked at that.
Or where
Could
they
it,
live,
pardon me?
or where they live, what do they
Yes.
live?
Yes.
And the traffic and the pollution.
Yeah, well, I say that in the film. I say that your postal code is a determinant of health.
Mike?
And then the other thing would be African ancestry, genetics. I feel you have to be cautious with that, because then that blames black people for their cancer. But that's what the cancer biologist does. She looks at race and cancer, so I'm not going to overstep. But I think we need to put more focus on external issues, like the dump, right? The social determinants of health. So we probably don't really agree with that, but we haven't gotten into fights. And that's the beauty of this project, is that we're from different disciplines, but there haven't been any conflicts. Everybody respects everybody's perspective. So we're doing that right now, and we're finished with the focus groups. So that was my part of the study, focus groups, interviews, and making sure that the research assistant, is guiding her around that. And then the cancer biologist and the microbiologist are looking at DNA sampling. So they got the community members to provide DNA sampling. So we're at the end of the project soon. We just have to wait for the DNA sampling results. Next slide. And of course, publication. As a scholar, I need to publish. Because I see this as very interdisciplinary, the publications have been in health journals, environmental justice journals, diversity journals, politics, current affairs. I've been able to publish in many places because of how multidisciplinary the topic is. I have a new book coming out, as I said, that's not on environmental racism. Sometimes I think I disappoint people, because some people have said to me, are you going to do a follow-up? And I feel like, I don't know, I've said everything, and maybe I will, but right now I feel like I've said everything I need to say. So, next slide. So there's the book. Next slide. And community capacity building. So, people don't trust professors. They think we're there to come, take information, extract the information from them, just to get tenure, to use them, to never return. And I was determined that I wasn't going to do that. And I continue to have friendships, relationships with Shelburne, as I just showed you. I started working with Louise in 2015, and this project I just showed you, we started that last year. So I'd like to continue to hold events where I'm still working with the same communities, and I find new ways to help them. One of the ways, next slide, is to build their capacity. And getting back to the hydrogeologist, when he said, let's do a water testing project. You want to give the communities a win? He asked me, and I said, what win, remember? And I said I was offended. Well, he said, test water. And I realized that most of the communities, the black communities anyhow, wanted their water testing. They told me that early on, but they said, we don't trust the government. I don't want the government to test our water because they're going to tell us it's fine. So we thought, we're independent. They can trust us. So he said, Ingrid, let's test water. And I said to him, I know about testing water. He said, Ingrid, I'm a hydrogeologist. I know how to test water. We can put together a working group, and we did. Him, myself, an environmental science professor at a college, an environmental science student, I think it was at University of Waterloo, and another student from Dalhousie. And this is 2016, and we got maps, historical data, profile on the community, and we tested the water at no cost. That's the whole point, because these are low-income communities. So the teacher, the environmental science teacher, uses lab over the summer, no cost, once again, to the community, tested the water, and we returned to the community with a report, findings, telling them how to manage their drinking water supply. That turned into an NGO that the three of us co-founded in 2017, myself, the hydrogeologist, and the environmental science professor, because the water testing project worked out so well. You know, it seemed to be a blueprint that we can use for an NGO, so we formed that NGO then. And even though I'm gone, I'm not in Nova Scotia anymore, it has survived. They continue to test water, and also in addition to doing that, we train homeowners to test their water. We train students to test their water and to lead the water testing projects. So it's really community capacity building in several ways. In 2018, we started Healthy Wells Day. Because many rural communities, as you know, maybe in Ontario, but I certainly know in Nova Scotia, are on well water. Well water tends to be more contaminated than municipal water. So I talked about Shelburne earlier, that the white community in the north end of Shelburne is on municipal water, the black community is on well water, ever since they migrated from the United States to Canada, to Nova Scotia. So that's a health issue. Maybe the cancers are also due to that, right? So we do this kind of annual online, on-site event using infographics, Facebook Live for the online portion of it, and then on-site we ask 3 communities, because that's all we can handle, to bring in their water, and then it's tested, and then we give them the results and we show them how to manage their drinking water supply. So this is, like, I'm proud of this. This is tangible, right? It's giving the community something to hold on to. As the hydrogeologist told me, he said, let's give them a win. Let's give them something tangible. And when I was about to get all offended, this has been the thing that I'm probably most proud of, this NGO. So, yeah, I've learned now that I need to listen, but I also I need to not think that people whose disciplines seem extremely foreign from mine don't have a place. Because now I realize that every discipline has a place in this topic, and probably every topic. Next slide. I only now, recently I started to get into climate justice. I was fearful of this as well. Like with environmental racism, I said, I certainly don't have a place in this. I'm not a climate scientist. Talking about greenhouse gas emissions, I can't do it. So I knew it was a pressing issue, the most pressing issue, but I thought to myself, people must think it's strange that I don't even talk about it, because it's connected to environmental racism, but I wouldn't even touch it. So I realized I needed to, but I came at it from a climate justice framework, and I did a report for the Canadian Climate Institute, and that's how I learned about, thank God they asked me to do it, because I learned so much about climate justice and about who's vulnerable and why. So right now, I'm doing a project in Nova Scotia on climate change in black communities, climate change preparedness. I'm doing 2 projects in the GTHA on climate change preparedness in black communities. We finished the workshops. These have been workshops on climate change preparedness in emergency situations and having people do simulation exercises, fake or mock climate change scenarios. And what's come out of these workshops is that people realize they need a plan, a resilient, climate resilient plan. So I'm at the stage right now that the workshops are done, is to connect to government. And today, I'm so excited, I connected to the City of Toronto. People want to work with me. They're very excited. I'm excited about what they have to offer. And I've also connected to the City of Hamilton. So the next stage is to take the participants who were in the workshops and allow them to distill their knowledge into practical, tangible work with the City of Hamilton, because many of them said to us, we want more after the workshops. They enjoyed it, and they said, we want more. They didn't know what they wanted, but they knew they wanted more. So that's the next step. I would say most of my projects now are climate related and not pollution or not environmental racism. Next slide. And I'm doing a project on environmental education. Next slide. But one of the things I do with respect to education, as I mentioned earlier, is mentorship of students. And I said earlier that students from so many different disciplines, and particularly at Dalhousie, came to me wanting mentorship and education, wanting to meet the communities that were being impacted. They're sitting in their classrooms, their environmental science classrooms, hearing about these communities in the news, never having a chance to meet with them. And through the Enrich project, because I had these relationships, I was able to have students go up to these communities and help, right? So mentorship and training of young people and students have been central to the work. Next slide. I'm also engaged in environmental curriculum. Next slide. I'm doing a project right now.
Well,
How little slide is there? Oh, there it is. I'm doing a project in Windsor, Essex, Ontario, around curriculum. So Kenny Gadabo, who runs a youth organization, he's a black man leading a kind of youth organization, came to me maybe 2 years ago, and he said, in Windsor, Essex, the black community has a lot of issues. You know, it's flooding, there are issues, and we try to speak to the government about it, but they ignore us. We want our children to be advocates, you know, because we're just not heard. And we think the curriculum has a role in that for the black young people, the youth. How can we use the curriculum to turn them into advocates? So we decided we would do a project on changing the curriculum. So is environmental issues, climate change issues, urban planning issues being taught in the school system in Windsor, Essex, Ontario, and does it reflect the black experience? Right, the black Canadian experience or the black experience in Windsor, Essex. So with this project, we have been doing focus groups with young people, high school students, to hear about their opinions about climate change, environmental racism, and urban planning issues, public infrastructure issues. What would they like to see in their curriculum? What classes do they think should be taught? What about the resources and videos and handouts that are being shared? How could it be more reflective of environmental issues in the black community in Windsor, Essex? That's what we're trying to get at. Then we're going to write a report, and then we're going to connect with the school board folks, administrators, superintendents, etc. This is a tough project. I know it's going to be challenging. Teachers don't want to be told how to teach or what to teach. And changing curricula in the school board is just very tough. So I don't know what really to expect from this project. It's not like they're going to say, yes, Ingrid, you're right, we're going to do everything you say, right? And then there's another piece of it, which is most of the teachers are white. So getting them comfortable with talking about some of these issues like racism, I know is difficult for white teachers. So we can't just expect to go in and do this project. There's also a little bit of training or something that we have to do in order to make teachers comfortable talking about this content. So I see this as my most difficult project. Next slide. And as you know, I've been trying to get legislation passed forever, starting in Nova Scotia in 2015 with Lenore Zan. We had a provincial bill called Bill 111. It was the first private members environmental racism bill in Canada, but also, of course, in Nova Scotia. And Lenore put it forward, introduced it in 2015, April. It went on to second reading in November of 2015. She put it forward every year until she switched over to the Liberal Party as an MP. At that time, when I met her, she was an NDP MLA. And it never went any further than second reading. So in 2020, it was just before COVID hit, she said to me, you know that Bill 111? And I said, yeah. She said, why don't we change that to a federal bill? And I said, well, that would be great because there are pipelines in Indigenous communities across Canada. We just can't confine ourselves to Nova Scotia. That doesn't make any sense. So I said, yes, a great idea. So we took that bill because we developed it back in 2015, but we made it probably a bit more robust for the federal bill. We were asking for more. We're asking for a study. We're asking for disaggregated race-based data connected to socioeconomic status, toxic risks, and health. Like that wasn't in the first bill. In the first bill, I think we were playing it safe. A lot of people didn't know about environmental racism, as I said. It freaked them out. And we thought we don't want to freak them out too much, so let's play it safe. This bill that just passed into law was much more robust, asking for more. So after we finished developing it, she introduced it February 26th of 2020. And then in December, I guess it was second reading or something, December 8th of 2020. And then, as you know, the snap election was called by Trudeau in 2021. When that happens, all private members' bills get wiped off the table. You got to start from scratch. So I said to Lenore, what now? Like, we've been on this journey since 2015. And she lost her seat. right? So it's to a conservative in Nova Scotia. She's no longer a politician. She's gone back to acting. She used to do that before she was a politician. So I said, what now? She said, well, I'm hearing that Elizabeth May might want to sponsor it. So we had a Zoom call, 3 of us, Elizabeth May, myself, and Lenore. And Elizabeth said, Ingrid, I'm happy to sponsor it, but I need to know that you're going to support it. I said, Lenore, I'm with this coalition. We're going to support it. We do campaigns, we do petitions. I said, if you are going to take it on, we will support you. And we did many campaigns, which I think really helped. And it was last year, I think it went to Senate, probably first reading. This year, second and third. And then June 13th, we heard it became law. And I thought I'd have an opportunity to see it live. I've been doing this for so long. And somebody just told me by email, oh, did you hear it pass? I said, no. No, I didn't hear. I mean, I was connected to people in the know. There was this particular woman who is an insider. And all of us for weeks were saying, when is it going to happen? Do you know when the third reading is going to happen? And then I get an email saying, did you hear Ingrid? It passed. Thank you for the applause, but as I say to people, while I'm all dizzy and it passed and that's great, the work begins, because you can have a bill pass and have it sitting on a table and nothing happens. So that can happen with this bill. I remind my colleagues, so we need to figure out a kind of strategy. What are we expecting? How do we communicate that without being abrasive? Our next meeting will be in Toronto with a celebration about the bill, but it's also going to be about what's next in terms of voting, because if Paul Poilievre takes over, he could get rid of the bill, I think. That's what I was told. Right, so we're thinking of next steps to make sure that the bill survives. Next slide, and this is Senate. And I've been talking a lot about what, next slide. I've been talking a lot about what the Enrich Project, my first organization, has been doing, but this is my second organization. I co-founded in 2020 with Nalo Charles, who's based in Toronto, and we look at climate change and environmental justice. It has been key in the campaigns that we did for the bill, and we've really developed a lot of national partnerships. We got David Suzuki on board, environmental defense, shake up the establishment.